The courthouse buzzed with anticipation as people filed into the oak-paneled courtroom, their whispers echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Emma Rodriguez sat in the witness waiting room, her small legs dangling from the chair, not quite reaching the floor. At 8 years old, she clutched a worn stuffed rabbit her mother had given her before she died 2 years ago. Her father, Michael Rodriguez, sat in the defendant's chair inside, accused of orchestrating a robbery at his own jewelry store, a crime that could send him to prison for 15 years. The prosecution's star witness was someone Emma had learned to fear, her stepmother, Victoria. Victoria had entered their lives 18 months ago, a whirlwind of perfume and promises. She'd swept Michael off his feet during his grief, offering comfort and companionship when he was most vulnerable. Emma had tried to like her, tried to accept this stranger who now slept in her mother's bedroom and rearranged their home. But something had always felt wrong. Victoria's smile never quite reached her eyes when she looked at Emma, and her kindness evaporated the moment Michael left the room. The little girl had learned to stay quiet, to make herself small, because speaking up only brought accusations of being difficult or jealous. The robbery had occurred 3 months ago, on a Tuesday evening when the store should have been closing. According to Victoria's testimony in the preliminary hearings, Michael had left her alone to lock up while he ran a mysterious errand. 2 masked men had burst in, she claimed, knowing exactly where the security cameras were positioned and which cases held the most valuable pieces. They'd cleared out over $200,000 in merchandise in under 10 minutes. When police investigated, they'd found suspicious financial records on Michael's computer and text messages that seemed to coordinate the timing. The evidence appeared damning, and Victoria's tearful testimony had been convincing. But Emma knew something no one else did. That Tuesday evening, she hadn't been at her grandmother's house, as Victoria had told police. Her after-school program had been canceled due to a teacher's illness, and Victoria had forgotten to pick her up. Emma had taken the bus to her father's store, something she'd done before in emergencies. She'd arrived just as twilight was falling, entering through the back door her father had shown her how to unlock with the hidden key. What she witnessed through the gap in the storage room door had changed everything, but fear had kept her silent until now. Today, Emma's grandmother had finally gotten her to talk. The elderly woman had noticed how the child flinched whenever Victoria's name was mentioned, how nightmares plagued her sleep, and how she'd withdrawn into herself since her father's arrest. With gentle persistence, Emma's grandmother had coaxed out the truth. Now, that truth was about to shake the courtroom and expose a betrayal that went deeper than anyone had imagined. Emma's hands trembled as she remembered that evening 3 months ago. She'd pushed open the back door of Rodriguez Fine Jewelry, expecting to find her father tallying the day's receipts or polishing display cases, as he often did before closing. Instead, she'd heard Victoria's voice, sharp and commanding, coming from the showroom. Something in her stepmother's tone made Emma freeze. It wasn't the sweet, simpering voice Victoria used around her father. This was cold, calculated, and completely in control. The little girl had hidden instinctively in the storage room, peering through the narrow gap between the door and its frame. What she saw made her blood run cold. Victoria stood in the center of the showroom, directing 2 men who definitely weren't customers. "The Cartier collection is in the 3rd case on the left," she'd said, pointing with a manicured finger. "And don't forget the vintage Patek Philippe watches in the safe. The combination is written in the notebook on Michael's desk, 2nd drawer down." The men moved with practiced efficiency, and Victoria checked her watch repeatedly, utterly calm as they systematically looted her husband's livelihood. Emma had wanted to scream, to burst out and stop them, but terror rooted her in place. She was 8 years old, barely 4 feet tall, facing 2 grown men and a stepmother who suddenly seemed like a stranger. She'd pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle any sound, tears streaming silently down her cheeks as she watched her father's business being destroyed. The men worked quickly, filling black duffel bags with jewelry that represented years of her father's work and dreams. Victoria supervised it all, occasionally stepping in to point out particularly valuable pieces they might have missed. The worst moment came when one of the men asked Victoria, "You're sure about this? Framing your own husband?" Victoria had laughed, a sound that would haunt Emma's nightmares. "He's worth more to me in prison than he ever was as a husband," she'd replied. "His life insurance policy is substantial, and if he dies in some tragic prison incident, well, that would solve a lot of problems. Besides, I've been planning this since the day I met him. Rich widower, successful business, trusting to a fault. He made it too easy." Emma had felt sick, realizing that every kind word, every gentle gesture Victoria had shown her father had been a carefully constructed lie. After the men left and Victoria had called the police with her Oscar-worthy performance of a traumatized robbery victim, Emma had slipped out the back door. She'd walked the 6 blocks home in the dark, arriving before Victoria returned with the police. When her stepmother found her there, Emma had seen something flash across Victoria's face: calculation, then relief. Victoria had quickly spun a story about Emma being at her grandmother's all evening, and Emma, terrified of what might happen if she contradicted the woman, had nodded numbly. That silence had become a weight she'd carried every day since, growing heavier as she watched her innocent father locked away. Emma's grandmother, Rosa Martinez, had been a force of nature her entire life. Even at 72, she possessed an uncanny ability to see through deception and a fierce protective instinct for her family. She'd never liked Victoria, sensing something false beneath the younger woman's polished exterior. When Michael was arrested, Rosa had wanted to take Emma in immediately, but Victoria had fought it, maintaining her role as the grieving stepmother and insisting she could provide stability for the traumatized child. The court had sided with Victoria, granting Rosa only limited visitation rights. Those supervised visits had become Emma's lifeline, brief respites from the tense atmosphere of Victoria's house. Rosa noticed everything: how thin Emma had become, how she startled at sudden sounds, how she never mentioned Victoria except in the briefest, most neutral terms. The vibrant child who'd loved painting and storytelling had become a silent shadow. Rosa knew abuse when she saw it, even if it left no physical marks. Emotional manipulation could be just as damaging, and she was certain Victoria was exercising some form of control over her granddaughter. It was during one November visit, when Emma had been particularly withdrawn, that Rosa decided to push. She'd taken the girl to their favorite cafe, ordered her favorite hot chocolate with extra marshmallows, and simply waited. Patience had always been Rosa's greatest tool as a mother and grandmother. She didn't interrogate or pressure. She just sat with her granddaughter, letting silence do the work. Finally, after nearly 20 minutes, Emma had whispered, "Abuela, what happens to people who know something bad but are too scared to tell?" Rosa's heart had skipped a beat, but she kept her voice calm. "Well, Mija, that depends on what they know. But I can tell you this: the truth has a way of demanding to be heard. And sometimes, the scariest thing isn't telling the truth, it's living with a lie forever." Emma had looked at her grandmother with eyes far too old for her young face, and the dam had finally broken. The story poured out in whispers and tears: the forgotten pickup, the arrival at the store, the horror of what she'd witnessed through that crack in the door. Rosa had listened without interrupting, her own heart breaking as she realized the burden this child had been carrying alone. When Emma finished, she'd looked terrified. She said, "If I ever told anyone what really happened, they'd never believe me because I'm just a kid and she's the grown-up. She said I'd end up in foster care and never see Papa again. Abuela, I want to tell the truth, but I'm so scared." Rosa had gathered her granddaughter into her arms, holding her tight while formulating a plan. "Listen to me, Emma. We're going to tell the truth, but we're going to do it the right way. I'm going to get you a lawyer, a good one, and we're going to make sure the judge hears every word you have to say. Victoria has underestimated you, Mija. She thought you'd stay silent forever. She was wrong." Attorney Sarah Chun had built her career on defending the vulnerable and exposing injustice. When Rosa Martinez contacted her office with a frantic explanation about her granddaughter witnessing the real robbery, Sarah had initially been skeptical. Eyewitness testimony from children was notoriously unreliable, often influenced by leading questions or wishful thinking. However, something in Rosa's voice convinced her to take the meeting. When she sat across from 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez and heard the child's account, detailed, consistent, and delivered with heartbreaking sincerity, Sarah knew this was genuine. The challenge would be getting the court to listen. Michael Rodriguez's trial was already underway, and the prosecution had built what seemed like an airtight case. Victoria's testimony had been compelling, supported by circumstantial evidence that painted Michael as a desperate man with gambling debts who'd staged a robbery for insurance money. The financial records showed suspicious transactions, though Michael maintained they were legitimate business expenses that Victoria had access to and could have manipulated. Text messages on his phone seemed incriminating, though he insisted he'd never sent them and someone must have accessed his device. Without concrete proof of his innocence, he was heading toward conviction. Sarah spent 2 weeks preparing Emma for what would be the most intimidating experience of her young life. They practiced in Sarah's office, role-playing the courtroom scenario. Sarah played both the friendly attorney and the harsh prosecutor, teaching Emma how to stay calm under aggressive questioning. "They're going to try to confuse you," Sarah explained. "They'll suggest your grandmother put these ideas in your head, or that you're making things up because you miss your father. You need to stay focused on what you actually saw and heard. Don't guess, don't embellish, just tell the truth exactly as it happened." Emma proved to be a remarkably resilient witness. She had an excellent memory for details, recalling specific pieces of jewelry the men had taken and exact phrases Victoria had used. Most convincingly, she could describe things she couldn't possibly have known unless she'd been there, like a distinctive tattoo on one robber's forearm that the investigation had never revealed publicly, or the fact that Victoria had been wearing a blue cashmere sweater that evening when she'd told police she'd been wearing black. Sarah cross-referenced every detail Emma provided with evidence from the case file, and each verification strengthened their case. The child wasn't fabricating or fantasizing, she was remembering. The night before Emma was scheduled to testify, Sarah visited the Rodriguez home, now controlled entirely by Victoria, with a court order allowing Emma to stay with her grandmother. Victoria had fought it viciously, her mask slipping for a moment in front of the judge when she'd snapped, "That child is disturbed and ungrateful." It was a small crack in her carefully maintained facade, but it was enough. As Sarah drove Emma and Rosa away from that house, she saw the little girl's shoulders relax for the first time. "Tomorrow," Sarah told her young client, "we're going to give your father his life back. Are you ready?" Emma clutched her stuffed rabbit and nodded, determination shining through her fear. The courtroom fell silent as Emma Rodriguez was called to the witness stand. Judge Margaret Sullivan, a veteran of family court cases, had initially been hesitant about allowing a child to testify, but Sarah Chen's emergency motion had been persuasive. The defense had new evidence, critical evidence, that could prove Michael Rodriguez's innocence. The judge had reviewed Sarah's summary in chambers and decided that justice required hearing the child out, though she warned both attorneys that she would intervene immediately if the questioning became inappropriate or traumatic. Emma walked slowly down the courtroom aisle, her small figure drawing every eye. Her father, seeing her for the first time in weeks, looked stricken, a mixture of love, concern, and confusion playing across his face. Victoria sat in the front row, her expression carefully arranged into sympathetic concern, but Sarah noticed the woman's knuckles turning white as she gripped her purse. The prosecutor, Daniel Morrison, looked irritated at this last-minute disruption to what he'd thought was a concluded case. He'd already delivered his closing arguments the previous day, confident in his victory. The bailiff brought over a box for Emma to stand on so she could be seen over the witness stand, a gesture that emphasized her vulnerability, but also her courage. Judge Sullivan leaned forward, her expression gentle. "Emma, do you know what it means to tell the truth?" Emma nodded solemnly. "It means saying exactly what happened, even if it's scary or even if someone told you not to." The judge smiled. "That's exactly right. And I want you to know that in this courtroom, you're safe. No one can hurt you for telling the truth here. Do you understand?" Emma's voice was small but clear. "Yes, Your Honor." Sarah began with simple questions, establishing that Emma was Michael's daughter, that her mother had passed away, and that Victoria had become her stepmother. She asked about Emma's relationship with her father, the bedtime stories, the weekend pancakes, the way he'd never missed a school play or parent-teacher conference. Emma's voice grew stronger as she talked about the man she knew, painting a picture of a devoted father who'd been lost in grief until Victoria appeared. Then Sarah's questions shifted to that Tuesday evening 3 months ago. "Emma, where were you on the evening of October 15th? Sarah asked. Emma took a deep breath. "I was at my papa's store. My after-school program got canceled, and I took the bus there." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. This contradicted Victoria's testimony that Emma had been at her grandmother's house. "And what did you see when you got to the store?" Emma's eyes found her father's, drawing strength from his presence, and began to speak. Her voice never wavered as she described Victoria directing the robbery, providing combinations, pointing out valuable pieces. She recounted the conversation about framing her father, the cold calculation in Victoria's voice, the way she'd laughed about his life insurance policy. Prosecutor Daniel Morrison approached the witness stand with the careful deliberation of a man recalculating his entire case. He'd built his reputation on being thorough and fair, and Emma's testimony had genuinely shaken him. However, his job was to test the credibility of witnesses, and that included children. He softened his normally aggressive courtroom demeanor, aware that attacking an 8-year-old too harshly would alienate the judge and any observers. "Emma, that's a very serious story you've told us. Do you understand that what you're saying could send your stepmother to prison?" Emma nodded, her small hands folded in her lap. "Yes, sir. But she should go to prison. She's the one who stole from Papa, and she lied about it to hurt him." Morrison paused, noting the child's directness. "Emma, you love your father very much, don't you?" Another nod. "And you must miss him terribly since he's been in jail." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "I miss him every single day. But I'm not making this up because I miss him. I'm telling what I saw because it's the truth and Papa doesn't deserve to be in jail." Morrison tried another angle. "You mentioned you were in the storage room, looking through a crack in the door. Isn't it possible you misunderstood what you were seeing? Maybe your stepmother was also a victim, being forced to help these men?" Emma shook her head firmly.
"No, sir."
She wasn't scared at all. She was in charge. She told them what to take and where things were. And she talked about planning it for a long time, since before she even married my papa. Nobody was forcing her to do anything. The prosecutor pulled out a photograph of the store's layout. "Can you show me exactly where you were standing?" Emma studied the image and pointed to the storage room location. Morrison measured the angle with his eyes. The child would indeed have had a clear view of the main showroom through that door. "And you said one of the men had a tattoo. Can you describe it?" Emma closed her eyes, remembering. It was on his left arm, near his wrist. It looked like a snake wrapped around a dagger, and it was black and red. Morrison flipped through his notes, and his expression changed. The police report mentioned that one suspect, later identified through security footage from a nearby business, had been arrested for an unrelated crime and did indeed have that exact tattoo. It was a detail never released to the public, not mentioned in any news coverage. There was no way Emma could have known about it unless she'd actually been there. He could see Judge Sullivan making the same connection, her eyebrows raising slightly. Attempting to recover, Morrison asked, "Why didn't you tell anyone about this right away? Why wait 3 months while your father sat in jail?" Emma's voice broke for the first time. "Because I was scared. Victoria told me that if I ever said anything, no one would believe me because I'm just a kid. She said I'd be taken away and put in foster care and never see Papa again. She said she'd make sure of it. I was so afraid and I thought maybe I could stay quiet and everything would be okay somehow, but it wasn't okay. Papa was in jail and I couldn't sleep and I kept having nightmares and finally I told Abuela because I couldn't keep the secret anymore." Judge Sullivan called for a brief recess, during which the courtroom erupted in whispered conversations. Sarah Chin used the time to confer with Emma, ensuring the child was holding up under the pressure. Michael Rodriguez sat stunned, his attorney frantically revising their defense strategy to incorporate this bombshell testimony. But all eyes kept returning to Victoria, who sat rigid in her seat, her carefully maintained composure beginning to fracture. When court resumed, Judge Sullivan made an unprecedented decision. Given the serious allegations made by this witness, I'm going to exercise my authority to question Mrs. Rodriguez directly. Victoria's attorney jumped up, objecting strenuously, but the judge overruled him. Your client has been the primary witness against the defendant, and now her credibility has been directly challenged by testimony that includes verifiable details. She will take the stand. Victoria had no choice but to comply, though her elegant stride to the witness stand had become noticeably less confident. Judge Sullivan began gently, reviewing Victoria's original testimony about the evening of the robbery. Victoria recited the familiar story smoothly. Michael had left her alone. The men had burst in. She'd been terrified. But then the judge's questions became more pointed. Mrs. Rodriguez, you testified that Emma was at her grandmother's house that evening.
Are you certain about that?
Victoria nodded emphatically. Absolutely. I dropped her off myself that afternoon. The judge pulled out a document. I have a statement here from Emma's after-school program director confirming that the program was canceled that day due to illness. If you dropped Emma at her grandmother's, why is there no record of you calling to arrange that? No phone calls between you and Rosa Martinez that day. Victoria's eyes flickered briefly. Panic, calculation, before settling back into calm assurance. I must have arranged it earlier in the week. I don't remember exactly, but I definitely dropped her off. Judge Sullivan wasn't finished. And yet Mrs. Martinez has provided sworn testimony that Emma was not at her house that evening, that in fact, she didn't see Emma until 2 days later and noticed the child seemed traumatized. Can you explain that discrepancy? Victoria's mask slipped further. The old woman is confused. She forgets things. She's probably mixing up her days. Sarah Chen rose with a request. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce phone records showing no communication between Mrs. Rodriguez and Mrs. Martinez for the entire week in question, as well as GPS data from Mrs. Rodriguez's vehicle showing she never drove to Mrs. Martinez's neighborhood that afternoon. The judge nodded, admitting the evidence. Victoria's attorney whispered urgently to his client, but she ignored him, her attention fixed on Emma, who sat beside her grandmother in the front row. The judge continued. Mrs. Rodriguez, Emma described in detail a blue cashmere sweater you were wearing during the robbery. You told police you were wearing black that evening. We have your clothing from that night in evidence. It is indeed a blue cashmere sweater, which you later claimed was a mistake in your initial statement. Emma also described a tattoo on one of the robber's arms with specific details that were never made public. Can you explain how an 8-year-old would know these things if she wasn't present? Victoria's composure finally cracked. That little brat has been coached. Her grandmother hates me, has hated me from the beginning. They've concocted this story together to frame me and free Michael. You can't seriously believe a child over me. Sarah Chen stood, ready to drive the final nails into Victoria's deception. Your Honor, if I may, I have additional evidence that corroborates Emma's testimony. She approached the bench with a folder thick with documents. After Emma came forward, we conducted our own investigation. We discovered that Victoria Martinez, who presented herself to Michael Rodriguez as a successful art dealer, has a criminal history she concealed from him. A collective gasp filled the courtroom as Sarah distributed copies to the judge, prosecutor, and defense table. The documents revealed a pattern that made sickening sense. Victoria's real name was Victoria Castellano, and she had 2 prior fraud convictions in other states. In Nevada, she'd married a wealthy casino owner and staged a similar robbery, though prosecutors hadn't been able to prove her involvement at the time. Her husband had served 3 years before evidence emerged suggesting he'd been framed, but by then Victoria had disappeared with a substantial insurance payout. In Arizona, she'd been directly convicted of insurance fraud after a clumsy attempt to stage a burglary of her own apartment. She'd served 18 months and been released 2 years before meeting Michael. Sarah continued, we also had a forensic analysis done of the text messages on Mr. Rodriguez's phone that supposedly showed him planning the robbery. The metadata reveals they were sent from his device, yes, but at times when he has alibis proving he was elsewhere. We believe Mrs. Rodriguez had access to his phone and sent these messages herself to create false evidence. She produced the forensic report, which showed the texts were sent from the Rodriguez home while Michael had been verifiably at his store or other locations with security camera footage confirming his presence. Victoria's attorney attempted damage control. Your Honor, my client's past mistakes don't prove she committed this crime. People can change, and she's been living an honest life since meeting Mr. Rodriguez. But even he sounded unconvinced, and Victoria's expression had transformed from controlled concern to barely suppressed rage. Her eyes locked onto Emma with such venom that Rosa instinctively pulled her granddaughter closer. Judge Sullivan noticed the look and made a note. Sarah wasn't finished. We also found evidence of Victoria making contact with known criminals through encrypted messaging apps on a second phone she kept hidden from her husband. We've identified one of the individuals she was communicating with as having the distinctive tattoo Emma described. He's currently in custody on unrelated charges, and after being shown Victoria's photograph, he's expressed willingness to testify in exchange for consideration on his own case. He confirms that Victoria planned and directed the entire robbery. The prosecutor, Daniel Morrison, stood slowly. His entire case was collapsing, and to his credit, he knew when to acknowledge the truth. Your Honor, in light of this new evidence, the state requests time to investigate these revelations thoroughly. We can no longer stand behind our case against Michael Rodriguez with confidence. It was a stunning reversal, and the courtroom buzzed with excitement. Judge Sullivan banged her gavel for order, then turned to Victoria with an expression of cold fury. Mrs. Rodriguez, or should I say Ms. Castellano, you are hereby ordered to remain in custody pending a full investigation into your role in this robbery and the false testimony you provided under oath. Bail is denied. As bailiffs moved to take Victoria into custody, she finally abandoned all pretense of civility. She lunged toward Emma, screaming obscenities and threats, revealing the monster that had always lurked beneath her sophisticated facade. Security subdued her quickly, but not before everyone in the courtroom had witnessed her true nature. Emma buried her face in her grandmother's arms, trembling but also feeling an enormous weight lift from her small shoulders. The secret that had been poisoning her life was finally out, and people believed her. Judge Sullivan ordered an immediate motion to dismiss all charges against Michael Rodriguez. Mr. Rodriguez, on behalf of this court, I apologize for the injustice you've suffered. You are free to go. All charges dismissed with prejudice. Michael's attorney helped him stand, the man looking dazed after months of imprisonment for a crime he didn't commit. His eyes searched the courtroom until they found Emma, and father and daughter rushed toward each other the moment the judge adjourned the proceedings. Their reunion was tender and heartbreaking, Michael dropping to his knees to hold his daughter, while both of them sobbed. I'm so sorry, Mija, he kept repeating. I'm sorry you had to carry this alone. I'm sorry I brought that woman into our lives. I should have protected you better. Emma clung to him, finally able to release months of pent-up fear and guilt. I wanted to tell you right away, Papa, but I was so scared. I thought I'd lost you forever. Rosa joined them, creating a circle of family that had been broken but was now beginning to mend. The legal aftermath moved swiftly. Victoria was charged with fraud, perjury, conspiracy to commit robbery, and attempting to frame Michael for the crime. The accomplice Sarah's team had agreed to testify fully, providing details of how Victoria had recruited him and planned every aspect of the robbery. Further investigation revealed she'd been systematically transferring money from the business accounts, preparing for the ultimate theft. Her plan had been to wait until Michael was convicted, divorce him while he was imprisoned, take everything, and disappear as she'd done before. Over the following weeks, Emma began therapy to process the trauma she'd experienced. Dr. Patricia Woods, a child psychologist specializing in abuse cases, helped Emma understand that none of what happened had been her fault. You were a child in an impossible situation, Dr. Woods explained during one session. Victoria manipulated you using fear, just like she manipulated your father using lies. The fact that you found the courage to speak up shows incredible strength. Slowly, Emma began to reclaim her childhood, painting again, laughing more freely, sleeping through the night without nightmares of her stepmother's cold eyes. Michael closed his jewelry store temporarily, unable to face the place where his life had been torn apart. He spent his days with Emma, making up for lost time and working with his own therapist to process the betrayal. "I kept thinking I should have seen the signs," he told Rosa one evening. "But she was so good at the deception. She studied me, learned exactly what to say, and do to make me trust her. I was vulnerable after losing Catherine, and she exploited that." Rosa squeezed her son-in-law's hand. "Predators are skilled at finding and exploiting vulnerabilities. You're not to blame for being human." 6 months after Victoria's arrest, life had developed a new rhythm for the Rodriguez family. Michael had sold the jewelry business, unable to separate it from the trauma it represented. Instead, he'd taken a position managing the jewelry department at a high-end department store, where he could use his expertise without the burden of ownership. The reduced stress allowed him to be more present for Emma, picking her up from school every day and helping with homework at the kitchen table. Emma had blossomed in therapy, regaining her confidence and finding her voice in more ways than one. She'd become something of a local hero after the case made news, though Sarah Chen had worked hard to protect Emma's privacy and keep media attention to a minimum. The little girl who'd been too frightened to speak had become an advocate, talking with Dr. Woods about how other children in scary situations could be helped to come forward. "Kids need to know that adults will listen," Emma said during a session, "and that telling the truth is always right, even when it's hard." Victoria's trial had been swift. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Emma's testimony, the accomplice's detailed confession, forensic evidence of her phone manipulations, and her own past convictions, she'd accepted a plea deal to avoid a longer sentence. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison for fraud, robbery, and perjury, with no possibility of parole for at least 10 years. As she was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, she'd made no apology, showing no remorse, her face a mask of bitter resentment. Michael had been granted a civil judgment against Victoria for damages, though recovering anything would be difficult since she'd already spent most of what she'd stolen. More importantly, he'd received public vindication. The prosecutor's office had issued a formal apology, and several news outlets had run stories about wrongful accusations and the importance of listening to all witnesses, even children. Michael used some of the settlement money to establish a legal defense fund for people wrongly accused of crimes, wanting something positive to come from their nightmare. The greatest healing came in small, everyday moments. Emma teaching her father how to braid her hair, something he'd never learned before. Sunday dinners at Rosa's house, filled with laughter and the comfort of family traditions. Emma's school art show, where she displayed a painting titled "Finding My Voice," an abstract piece in bold colors that her teacher said showed remarkable emotional maturity. Michael standing in the audience at Emma's school play, tears streaming down his face because he was there to watch her shine. One evening, as Michael tucked Emma into bed, she asked the question that had been troubling her. "Papa, do you think you'll ever trust anyone again? Will you ever want to get married again?" Michael considered carefully, respecting her question enough to answer honestly. "I don't know, Mija. Right now, I'm focused on us, on our family, on healing. Maybe someday I'll be ready to open my heart again, but if I do, you'll be part of that decision. I promise never to bring someone into our lives without making sure they're genuine and kind, and that they treat you with the respect and love you deserve." Emma smiled, satisfied with his answer. "We're okay. Just us and Abuela, aren't we?" Michael kissed her forehead. "We're more than okay. We're strong, we're together, and we're going to be fine." As he turned out the light, Emma whispered one more thing. "Papa? I'm glad I was brave enough to tell the truth." Michael's voice was thick with emotion as he replied, "Me too, sweet girl. Me too. Your courage saved us both." The Rodriguez family's story became a reminder that justice sometimes comes from unexpected places, that children deserve to be heard and believed, and that the truth, no matter how difficult to speak, has the power to set people free. Emma kept her stuffed rabbit, the one her mother had given her, as a reminder of everything she'd been through and survived. But she no longer needed to clutch it for comfort. She'd found her strength, her voice, and most importantly, she'd found her way back to her father and the life they would build together, carefully, honestly, and with hard-won wisdom about the preciousness of trust and the resilience of love.